first. So Middle Age art is about like the Christianity art, which means it's really very religious. So according to tradition, Jesus, known as the Christ, was born in Bethlehem during the reign of Emperor Augustus. In time, his followers would become so influential in world affairs that our common calendar takes as its starting point the presumed date of Jesus' birth, calling it year 1. As a matter of fact, the 6th century calendar makers who devised this plan were wrong in their calculations. Jesus probably was born between 4 and 6 years earlier than they had supposed, but the calendar has nevertheless become standard. So here is the Rome. The Roman Empire dominated the Mediterranean region from the 2nd century BCE, now from the ancient Rome, later extending its control of Western Europe and the Middle East. But by the 4th century, the empire was crumbling in the West. So the Christianity was one of the numerous religions in the late Roman Empire, but it quickly became one of the most popular and well-organized. So Rome's attitude toward this new cultural force within its borders varied. Often the faith was tolerated, especially since it came to attract an increasing number of wealthy and influential people. At other time, Christians were persecuted, sometimes officially, and sometimes by mobs. One reason for the persecutions was that Christians refused to worship the gods and the goddesses of the state religion, including the emperor himself, in addition to their own god. So clearly, such people were a threat to the political stability and well-being of the empire. And the Christianity's situation changed abruptly in the year 313, when the Roman Emperor Constantine, this is the Constantine, issued an edict of tolerance for all religions. Not only were all faith now free to practice openly, but also Constantine himself patronized Christianity. So while battling his political enemies in 312, Constantine had a vision of a cross with the inscription in the sign concord. He interpreted this to mean that following Christian teachings and worship the Christian God would lead him to victory. He won the battle and converted to the Christian faith. So this is an arch of Constantine in Rome. His triumphal art is a monument erected to commemorate these victories. It pictures the battle that secured his imperial title, as well as scenes of past emperors' triumph and personifications of victory. So let's see the detail, the sculpture of the Constantine. The panel picturing Constantine and his court features small, stereotyped figures, drapery described with thick lines and limited spatial depth. So everyone, let's compare ancient Greece and the Middle Age sculptures here. The left one is the the ancient Greek sculpture, the Hellenism period sculpture, and the right one is the Middle Ages sculpture. Can you find the differences between these two sculptures? We can see the obvious differences. What's the difference?
It seems like the ancient Greece one is more so like I want to say like 3D. Versus the Middle Age, it seems like they just carved it out of a wall or something.
Very good. Yes. Now let's focus on the creation date, the creation year. So can you believe it? The left one, the Hellenism sculpture, the Greek sculpture is made before the century. And the right one, the Middle Age sculpture, is created after the century. So the left one, it has the implied motion of the sculpture shows like very advanced technique of freestanding sculpture, and the skin and the muscle looks real. And it is hard to believe that sculpture's material is marble. It looks very soft. Also, we can feel the dramatic emotion through this sculpture. So it feels like we are in the middle of the happening. Again, the creation date is before the century. On the other hand, so look at the arch of the Constantine's sculpture. So it looks like a flat sculpture and it doesn't show any volume. Also, all the figures in this sculpture depicted as not realistic and very simple. Feels like the advanced Greek technique was going back to the Mesopotamia art, even though this is made 400 years later, since the left Greek sculpture had been made. So the reason is that Christianity treats artists as craftsmen. So they don't want to make any figures realistic and idealized. They didn't accept anything beautiful or idealized art, not other than worship of their God, like Jesus Christ. So they don't care about advancement of artistic technique. They only focused on the description of the Bible. So that's why many of scholars have called the Middle Ages as dark ages in art. And the same thing was happened in paintings as well. So all the stories are about Christianity for 1,000 years. They describe baby with the same proportion of adult. They just make it smaller. And this is another example of Middle Age painting. So you can see the gold circle behind the figures, which is representing the light. So when you compare these two paintings, the left one is the ancient Romans painting and the right one is the Middle Ages painting. So like the comparison of the sculpture, the ancient Romans painting is very realistic, but the Middle Ages painting is simplified. That's the difference. So the style of art in Roman Empire had changed. The beauty of the human body was no longer important to artists. So now art emphasized the symbolism and narrative clarity with signs borrowed from pagan art, but repurposed with Christian meaning. The idealized bodies and the individualized faces of the classical era had been replaced with stylized figures and generic facial features. However, their architecture techniques were flourished to build many churches at the time. So we're going to see the Middle Ages architecture styles, the churches' styles. So under Constantine's imperial sponsorship, architects raised a series of large and opulent churches at key locations in the empire. One of these was Old St. Peter's, built on the spot in Rome, where it was believed that Peter, Jesus' first apostle, had been buried. Christianity from the beginning emphasized congregational worship, and so a fundamentally different kind of building was needed, one that could contain a lot of people. So a multi-purpose meeting hall called a basilica, this is it, and it was the standard building types of Roman architects. So based on the basilica we just saw, the architects of Middle Ages developed three styles of the churches. The first one is Byzantine architecture, and the next one is Romanesque architecture, and the last one is Gothic architecture. So let's see one by one. So this is the Byzantine style architecture. The Byzantine Emperor Justinian I was a devoted patron of the arts. He funded hundreds of churches, mosaics, and painting throughout his empire. Byzantine churches are grandeur, as you can see, with large scale. And it has dome, which is a hemisphere shaped roof, all the dome. And this is the inside of Byzantine church. And mosaic was a favorite Byzantine technique to decorate the exterior and the interior of the building. Byzantine artists have moved away from the neutralism and realism of Greece and Rome toward a flattened, abstracted style. Like artists of ancient Egypt, Byzantine artists strove to portray often complex religious doctrines and beliefs, not scenes from daily life. Now let's move on to the Romanesque architecture style. The Romanesque period was marked by a building boom. The contemporary commentators were thrilled at the beautiful churches that seemed to be springing up everywhere. So later, art historians called the style of these buildings Romanesque, for despite their great variety, they shared certain features reminiscent of ancient Roman architecture, including an overall massiveness, thick stone walls, round arches, like this, round arches, and very vaulted stone ceiling. And now this is the last architecture style in the Middle Ages. It's Gothic. So the Gothic style was started by a powerful French abbot named Schubert, who wanted to enlarge and remodel his church. The Abbey Church of Saint Denis near Paris, he came to believe that an ideal church should have certain characteristics. It should appear to reach up to heaven. It should have harmonious proportions, and it should be filled with light. So to fulfill those goals, his architects responded with pointed arches, ribbed vaulting, flying buttresses. It is ornate, linear, vertical elements that direct the eye upward. And it has a stained glass window so large, it seemed like translucent walls with the beautiful and exotic colors. Also, the sculptures of the Gothic style church were made very long, like the church's roof. So during Middle Ages, architecture was flourished by building churches. So these three styles are clearly different. Byzantine architecture style is grandeur and a larger scale with the dome and mosaic. And the Romanesque architecture style is simple and modern with round arch windows. And lastly, Gothic architecture style is sophisticated and extravagant with pointed arches, and the pointed roofs and the stained glass window. So we have a discussion related to this chapter, the Middle Age art. It's in week 10-1. Go to week 10, and you will see the Middle Age discussion. So this is the topic. The Middle Age was a time of strong religious belief, and selected artworks, each made for believers of a different religion, and contrast how the artist has emphasized the religious elements of the artwork. So that's the topic for this Renaissance. What's a Renaissance, everyone? It's so popular. What is it? What's the Renaissance? Does anyone know about the Renaissance? We heard that word a lot, right? So the Renaissance is one of the biggest cultural movement in history between 15th and the 17th century. The Renaissance happened in literature, music, art, architecture, and all kinds of intelligence. So let's see how it begins. So during Middle Ages, we just saw the Middle Ages, the church had taught that mankind was not worthless in the eyes of God. So this era, again, is called the Dark Ages. And all kinds of culture and art were oppressed by the church in the Middle Ages. And artists were considered skilled crafts workers. For the resistance of the Middle Ages, the Renaissance came into the world. So the word Renaissance means rebirth, and it refers to the revival of interest in ancient Greek and Roman culture. That is one of the key characteristics of this period. And Renaissance humanists believed in the pursuit of knowledge for its own sake. So there are many of artistic techniques developed by the Renaissance masters. The perspective, which is creating an implied space. like the 3D effect on the two-dimensional surface, and chiaroscuro, which is modeling mass drawing technique based on lightness or darkness. And close observation of nature, study of anatomy, and theories of beauty and proportion. So these established painting, sculpture, mathematics. And artists were no longer mere crafts workers. And the Renaissance arose in Italy again. So everyone, I have a question for you. So why did the Renaissance begin in Italy? And why was the Renaissance in Italy the most popular? Can you guess the reason? There are 3 reasons. The ones here?
Does it have anything to do with
Yeah, anything.
like I know there was a lot of like ancient like work, and then it was like the heart of like the Roman Empire. Does that have anything to do with it?
Oh my gosh, Nico. Yes, that's the one of the reason. Very good. Yeah, that's the one of the reason. Can you guess other reasons? All right. Let me share the reasons. So the first reason is that Italy was the powerful city-state which was engaged in intensive trade and the banking and developed. So their economic system was stable. Now, through history, most of culture were flourished when they have a stabilization of economy. And the second reason is the church. The church in Italy was an important patron of the arts. It was centered in Italy as well. And the last reason, Nico just said, the ancient Rome. So Italians had long lived in the ruin of ancient Rome, and they viewed themselves as the direct descendants of the citizens of the earlier. Very good. So these 3 factors made that the early and high Renaissance and developed in Italy. Now we will see the great masters of the Renaissance together. So there are 3 masters, and the first master we're going to see is Leonardo da Vinci. So Leonardo da Vinci was a painter, sculptor, poet, architect, engineer, scientist, musician, and all-round intellectual. Leonardo da Vinci is the artist who most embodies the term Renaissance man. And many people consider him to have been the greatest genius who ever lived. He was possessed of a brilliant and inquiring mind that accepted no limits. So he was very interested in the human body, like skeleton, muscles, organ, etc. And he anatomized the dead bodies to study skeletal system, muscle, and even organs and pregnancy. So this is the last Super by Leonardo da Vinci. He depicted the consternation that occurred among the 12 apostles when Jesus announced that one of them would betray him. Leonardo da Vinci used perspective technique to show an implied space on the two-dimensional surface. In this painting, he used one-point linear perspective. This is the vanishing point, the center of the implied space. So this is a good perspective technique for compacting many objects in a limited space. And these are sketches to study one-point perspective by Leonardo da Vinci. This is a drawing to show the one-point perspective with the human body proportion. Oh, and the most famous painting in the world, Mona Lisa. So it is an oil painting on a wood panel by Leonardo da Vinci, probably the world's most famous painting. This painting was one of the first portraits to depict the sitter in front of an imaginary landscape. And Leonardo da Vinci was one of the first painters to use aerial perspective. So behind her, a vast landscape recedes to icy mountains, winding path here, and distance bridge give only the slightest indications of a human presence. Leonardo da Vinci has chosen to place the horizon line like this, not at the neck, but on a level with the eyes, thus linking the figure with the landscape and emphasizing the mysterious nature of the painting. Now I'm going to share a video about this Mona Lisa painting to see this painting in detail.
Almost from the time Leonardo applied the finishing brushstrokes, the Mona Lisa was famous. It is arguably the best known painting in the world. In fact, today it is synonymous with the word art. So, how did it become so famous? And is the notoriety justified? First, let's address the work itself. It's a half-length portrait painted on a wood panel and completed between 1503 and 1506. The sitter is Lisa Gherardini, and the work was commissioned by her husband. It appears to be a rather stately portrait. The subject is erect, and her hands are together in her lap in a very reserved, dignified manner. Her head is turned to the three-quarter. However, her expression belies the formality of the pose. There's that famous Mona Lisa smile. It turns up ever so slightly at the corners. What is it? A smirk, self-satisfaction, subtle skepticism? You pick the adjectives. It's wide open for interpretation. Her eyes are equally enigmatic. She is not focused on us or the painter, but something or someone just to our right. The eyes have the look of knowledge, but there is perhaps a slyness in her gaze. It has an incredibly lifelike quality. It's one of the few portraits I know where the sitter and the viewer share a true connection. It's also one of the first portraits painted against a landscape background. The portrait was painted using a technique called sfumato, the soft blending of tones so that there are no lines. Varnish has yellowed and darkened the painting over time, making it difficult to appreciate. To get a sense, here's a painting executed at the same time by one of Leonardo's pupils. It is undoubtedly a great work, but it wasn't until it was stolen by a maintenance worker in 1911 from the Louvre in Paris that it became a cause célèbre. It dominated the news for 2 years until the painting was recovered. By then, the image of the painting was burned into the world's collective consciousness. It's only because it's so famous that Duchamp's desecration of the work makes any sense. I'm Larry Withers, and this has been your 2-minute masterpiece.
Let's just stop the video right here and go back to the lecture slide. Now, let's move on to the second master of the Renaissance, Michelangelo. So the Michelangelo is beyond legend. His name means Archangel Michael. And to his contemporaries and those who came after, his stature is scarcely less than that of heavenly being. He began serious work as an artist at the age of 13 and did not stop until death claimed him 76 years later. His equal may never be seen again for only a particular time and place could have bred the genius Michelangelo. Michelangelo was Leonardo da Vinci's rival. He began his career in Florence, but also worked in Rome. So it looks familiar with us, right? The Michelangelo had established his reputation as a sculptor by the age of 25. This is the David statue. So it is not a simple restatement of Greek art. He studied human anatomy and had dissected corpses. He translated this knowledge into a figure that seems to be made of muscle and flesh and bone, through all in marble. The material is marble. I'm going to share a video to see this amazing sculpture together in detail.
Florence was long an economic powerhouse. Rather than its church, it's the city hall, once the palace of the Medici family that towers over the main square. Michelangelo's David originally stood here. This is a copy. The original David is the centerpiece of the nearby Accademia Gallery, which feels like a temple to humanism. At its altar, one very impressive human. The shepherd boy, David, sizes up the giant. Thoughtful and self-assured, he seems to be thinking, I can take him. The statue was an apt symbol, inspiring Florentines to tackle their Goliaths. When you look at David, you're looking at Renaissance man. Artists now made their point using realism. They did this by merging art and science. For instance, Michelangelo actually dissected human corpses to better understand anatomy. This humanism was not anti-religion. Now people realized that the best way to glorify God was not to bow down in church all day long, but to recognize their talents and to use them. Artists like Michelangelo even exaggerated realism to make their point. Notice David's large and overdeveloped right hand. This is symbolic of the hand of God. It was God that powered David to slay the giant. And Florentines like to think God's favor enabled them to rise above rival neighboring city-states. The nave-like hall leading to David is lined with Michelangelo's unfinished prisoners, struggling to break out of the marble. Michelangelo believed these figures were divinely created within the rock. He was simply chiseling away the excess. Here we see the Renaissance love of the body as Michelangelo reveals these compelling figures. While these statues are called unfinished, perhaps Michelangelo was satisfied he'd set them free, and he moved on to other challenges.
All right. Michelangelo embarked on the masterpiece that has become his best known work, the ceiling frescoes of the Sistine Chapel in the Vatican in Rome. He had been called to Rome by Pope Julius II, who wanted the artist to design his tomb, a large monument with numerous sculptures and paintings. So, can you believe it? He painted all the single things on the ceiling and the wall himself, and this decoration parts and the sculpture parts are also painting. So it's a giant painting on the church ceiling. So let me share a video to see this amazing work of art.
Which has tremendous importance to Catholicism. This is where the Pope will lead Mass, but perhaps most famously, this is the room that the College of Cardinals uses to decide the next Pope.
And every surface of this space is decorated, from the beautiful mosaics on the floor. The walls are painted with frescoes by early Renaissance artists. The wall behind the altar was painted by Michelangelo later in his life. And then, of course, the ceiling.
And everybody is looking up. Their necks are craned, and of course, it's magnificent. We're here in the late afternoon on a day in early July. The light is diffuse, and it makes those frescoed figures feel so dimensional. They feel like sculpture.
And you can imagine what it was like when this was unveiled in 1512, after Michelangelo had worked on it for years, how different, how revolutionary Michelangelo's figures seemed.
Well, he was first and foremost a sculptor, and it wasn't actually until a relatively recent cleaning that we knew his brilliance as a colorist. But for him, line and drawing and the act of carving figures out of paint was primary. And you have this extraordinary ability to render both strength and elegance simultaneously.
They have a massiveness and a presence that is charismatic, but there's also a sense of elegance and ideal beauty. So let's describe what we're looking at.
Okay, probably the most important are the series of 9 scenes that move across the central panels.
And those are framed by a painted architectural framework that looks real. It doesn't look like paint. And we start with the creation of the world, God separating light from darkness.
I love that scene. This primordial God, light on one side of his body and the darkness of night on the other. This initial separation and division to create order in the universe.
And then we move through to the creation of Adam, the creation of Eve.
Well, the separation of the sexes.
And the creation of God's most perfect creature, human beings. And then the fall of human beings.
In a sense, the separation of good and evil.
Man and woman disobeying God, causing the expulsion of Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden. And then the far end, by the entrance, we see the scenes of Noah.
So these are all scenes from the first book of the Bible, from the book of Genesis. And it's so interesting because, of course, this is a Catholic church, and yet we don't see images of Christ. But these Old Testament scenes lay the foundation for the coming of Christ.
And Christ is present in other ways. Not only does the disobedience of Adam and Eve make the coming of Christ necessary. But when we look on either side of those central scenes, we see the prophets and the sibyls who predicted the coming of a savior for mankind.
The image of the Libyan Sibyl that we're sitting directly across from is spectacularly beautiful. So sibyls are these ancient pagan soothsayers who can foresee the future and, according to the Catholic tradition, foretell the coming of Christ. But look at the Libyan Sibyl. Look at the power of her body and look at the elegance with which she twists and turns. There's that sense of potential in the way that her toe just reaches down and touches the ground. It seems as if she's in the act of moving and possibly of standing.
There's a presence and drama to these figures, to the Libyan Sibyl especially. She twists her body in an almost impossible way. And we can see Michelangelo has articulated every muscle in the back. And in fact, we know that he used a male model for that figure.
I'm so taken with the color here. When I first studied Michelangelo, we spoke only of line, of sculptural form. But of course, after the dramatic cleaning of the Sistine Chapel, those original colors, their brilliance, their delicacy came out.
And we see purples and golds and oranges and blues and greens.
She, of course, is reaching back, and presumably that's a book of prophecy that she holds. And there's a look of confidence and knowing on her face, the absolute clarity with which she knows that Christ will come.
Sitting on the architectural framework on the four corners of all of the central scenes are male nude figures that we refer to as ignudi.
I think this is really important because Michelangelo is not painting simply separate paintings, but he's creating this enormously complex stage set with which to create levels of reality. And so, for example, the Libyan Sibyl seems as if she is seated amongst the architecture, and then set next to her are bronze figures. And then in the spandrels, as you mentioned, other scenes that seem to recede into a kind of illusionistic distance.
And then relief sculptures on the architecture on either side of her. And then seated above those, the beauty. And it's so clear that we're at this moment at the rediscovery of ancient Greek and Roman sculpture. And Michelangelo is in Rome, he's in the Vatican.
This is the High Renaissance. And it's so interesting to compare the optimism, the elegance, the nobility of the figures on the ceiling with a far darker and more pessimistic view that Michelangelo will paint decades later on the back wall, The Last Judgment.
That's right. Well, there's a big difference between 1512, when Michelangelo completes the ceiling, and when he begins The Last Judgment. The Protestant Reformation has begun and the church is under attack.
Michelangelo's world had been shattered, but when you look at the ceiling, you see instead all of the optimism, all of the intellectual and emotional power that characterizes the High Renaissance in all of its newfound appreciation for the ancient world. This was a moment of incredible promise, and all of that comes shining through these figures.
And let's not forget that just a few doors away, simultaneously, Raphael is painting the frescoes in the Papal Palace.
So this is not the Michelangelo's painting. This is the last, the youngest master of the Renaissance painting, Raphael. So let me just stop the video right here. And let's go back to the lecture slide. So it's a truly amazing painting. So and the ceiling frescoes were an immediate success, and Michelangelo continued as a papal's favorite. So the Pope Paul III encouraged the sculptor to, the Michelangelo, to work as an architect. In 1546, Paul named Michelangelo the official architect of the new St. Peter's, one of the four most important churches in Rome. By the time he began work on the project, Michelangelo was an old man, well into his 70s, and physically tired, but his creative vigor was undiminished. Michelangelo did not live to see his church finished. The magnificent central dome was complete after his death by another architect. So let me share a video to see this last masterpiece by Michelangelo.
Standing in St. Peter's Basilica in the Vatican City in Rome, and it is one of the largest, most ornate spaces I've ever been in. I shouldn't say one of the most, it is the most.
And that was the idea. Pope Julius II, who commissioned the rebuilding of this church in the early 16th century, said to Bramante, the first architect, said, make me the most magnificent, biggest church in all of Christendom. And so that's what he did.
Ultimately, yes, that's what we have. But that's not what this place was originally. If you go back to the ancient Roman era, this was Nero's circus, a place where games were performed, sporting events were performed. This was a place where Nero himself apparently actually rode a chariot.
And it was also a place where there was an ancient necropolis, a burial ground, and by tradition, the place where St. Peter himself was crucified and then buried. The early Christians created a monument on that site.
Apparently quite small and humble.
And then Constantine builds a church on this site because, after all, St. Peter is the first pope, the first leader of the church, given that job by Christ himself.
And that would have been the 4th century. So actually very early, that church, Constantine's St. Peter's, lasted for 1,000 years, a little more.
Early 1500s, Pope Julius II, a very ambitious pope.
Julius had this extraordinary vision, and he brought together some of the most talented artists to develop this extraordinary space.
Beginning with the great high Renaissance artist Bramante, who did the initial plans for the rebuilding of St. Peter's, through the great artists Raphael and Michelangelo of the high Renaissance, as you said, the greatest minds of the Renaissance, and then later the Baroque in the early and mid 1600s worked on this building.
Bramante understood this church as distinct from the way most churches had been built, that is, borrowing from the ancient Roman basilica plan.
And most churches that anyone probably knows are basilica plan. It's a very practical kind of plan for a church. It's got a long central area. It allows for easy passage of large numbers of people. It focuses on the altar. And so it
just worked well.
It works really well.
But that's not what Bramante wanted.
No, and that makes sense. And if you understand the mindset of the high Renaissance, where there was an enormous interest in mathematics and in ideal, perfect beauty and finding perfect proportions, Bramante's first design for St. Peter's was very much based on those ideas. It was a Greek cross with equal arms instead of one longer arm, and it was inscribed within a square with a dome over the center and smaller domes.
In essence, it really was a series of perfect circles and perfect squares, but Bramante's design didn't survive.
No, but people went back and forth to it, but ultimately what we ended up with in the end is an extension of one of the arms of the cross. And so the plan ultimately does follow a basilica format. That perfect geometric form gave way to the practical needs of the church to hold large numbers of people and to focus attention on the altar.
So after Bramante, Raphael has a hand in the design and ultimately passes to Michelangelo. What Michelangelo was able to do before the later Baroque additions was to expand on, simplify, and clarify Bramante's original ideas, and his work can be seen in the dome and on the exterior of the 3 sides of the church that were not extended. And then, of course, Mandorno will add his Baroque facade.
And Bernini will decorate the interior of the church during the Baroque era as well, with the baldacchino, the Cathedra Petri, and will also extend the front of the church, creating the piazza, the St. Peter's Square.
That's right, those extraordinary arms, that double colonnade.
Right, so there's a century and a half or so of work on this church, a series of great architects and sculptors who work on it. It all works in the end.
It really comes together, and it is one of the most magnificent spaces on the face of the earth.
Yep, it is. So now let's see the last Renaissance master, Raphael. He was a slightly younger rival of Michelangelo. His work is admired for its clarity of form, ease of composition, and visual achievement of the Neoplatonic ideal of human grandeur. So now looks familiar with us. Now, this is Raphael's the most famous painting, the School of Athens. So this painting is in the new St. Peter's Church we just saw in the video, which was the Michelangelo's last work. Nearly every great Greek philosopher is presented here, including two main subjects on the vanishing point. Now, Plato and his student Aristotle. In one of his earliest work, Raphael painted three of the Graces from classical mythology. And this painting is best known for the two winged angels at the very bottom of the composition. The Sistine Madonna is an oil painting that was commissioned in 1512 by Pope Julius II for the Church of San Sisto in Piacenza. And upon its completion in 1512, this rendering of Pope Julius II was unlike any previous papal portrait. Usually popes were painted frontally or kneeling in profile, but the Pope was not frontally and not in profile. Also, exceptional was the facial expression and showing the subject lost in thought. And this oil painting was produced in 1505 in Venice. Madonna del Plero exemplifies a religious theme. It depicts Mother Mary with Jesus Christ and John the Baptist in the painting. Mary is guarding the two children. So compared to the previous two masters, Raphael's paintings are very soft and smooth, and it makes views feel comfortable to see. So the scholars generally date the end of the High Renaissance in Italy to the death of Raphael in 1520. Of the various artistic trends that emerged, the one that has interested art historians most is known as Mannerism. So the late Renaissance in Italy is called Mannerism. The word Mannerism comes from the Italian maniera, meaning style or stylishness, and it was originally used to suggest that these painters practiced an art of grace and sophistication. So later critics characterized Mannerism as a descendant reaction against the order and balance of the High Renaissance. So today, most scholars agree that Mannerism actually grew out of possibilities suggested by the work of the High Renaissance artists, especially Michelangelo, whose influence on the next generation was enormous. So look at the left image together. These are Michelangelo's, ceiling painting from the Sistine Chapel in Vatican. So compared to the other two masters, Michelangelo's painting style is a little bit more exaggerated. And now look at the right painting. So this is the mannerism painting from the late Renaissance. So it's pretty much persuaded that mannerism grew out of Michelangelo's style, right? So compared to the art that came before it, works in the later phase of the Renaissance are often depicted in mannerism, which tends to feature compositions that are more chaotic, emphasize movement, and possesses greater emotional intensity. The successes of the High Renaissance could not be rivaled. Leonardo da Vinci, Raphael, and Michelangelo were thought to have achieved perfection in the arts. And artists were faced with the predicament of where to go from there. In reaction, instead of harmony, many artworks stressed dissonance. So the distortion and disproportion were intentionally used to emphasize certain anatomical features and themes. So rather than mathematically precise depictions, artists created ambiguous spaces with multiple focal points, just like this work of art. And the Renaissance became widespread in North Europe. So there is a video about the Renaissance in the North Europe in the page of week 10. Please watch it to see diverse and beautiful Renaissance work of art. So I hope you enjoy to see the Renaissance mastered beautiful words through this chapter. And we have a sketchbook project related to this chapter. Guess what it is? It's a perspective drawing. Let's learn Renaissance master's technique through this sketchbook project. So we just learned the Renaissance, and the masters of the Renaissance discovered and used perspective drawing technique to create implied space on two-dimensional surface. So again, we are going to do perspective drawing to understand their technique for through this sketch project. So the perspective linear or point projection perspective is one of two types of graphical projection perspective in the graphic art. Linear perspective is an approximate representation, generally on a flat surface, such as paper, of an image as it is seen by the eye. The most characteristic features of linear perspective are that objects appear smaller as their distance from the observer increases, and that they are subject to foreshortening, meaning that an object's dimensions along the line of sight appear shorter than its dimensions across the line of sight. So also all objects will recede to points in the distance, usually along the horizon line, but also above the below the horizon line, depending on view used. So this is the Last Supper by Leonardo da Vinci. So in this painting, he used 1 point linear perspective with vanishing point on the center of the implied space. And this is another example of 1-point linear perspective drawing. Oh, and this is a 2-point linear perspective example. It is a good technique to show a dynamic view with foreshortening in drawing. And this is another example of 2-point linear perspective drawing. So as you see, it is slightly harder than the 1-point perspective because of adding one more point. So for this project, you will need a sketchbook, ruler, pencil, eraser, and any color medium you have. And I will give you 9 options for this project. Please choose one of the perspective options and must draw one of the option based on 1-point or 2-point linear perspective. And as usual, please write which option you choose for this project and post the work process image in the Moodle room. So now let me show you the options. So the option files is posted in the week 10 of the Moodle room. So you can see it while you're drawing. So this is the first option. As you can see, all the pictures have the perspective guide like this. So this is the 2-point perspective. No, I've made the guidelines so you can make the the angle easily. And this is the second option, which is the 1-point perspective picture. Oh, it looks hard. It's the third option with the 2-point perspective. And fourth option, the 2-point linear perspective. And the fifth option, 2-point linear perspective. This is the sixth option, 2-point linear perspective. And the seventh option, 1-point perspective. The vanishing point is on the left side, and it is hiding by the wall, the front wall. And the eighth option, 1-point linear perspective with a vanishing point. And the 2-point perspective, this is the last option. So please choose one of them, and then you're going to draw it. So first, you're going to choose one of the option like this, for example. Again, the option files, the option file is in the Moodle room, week 10 page. And next, check out the your images, now the perspective, and then sketch it. And lastly, you're gonna color it. I used the pastel for this. So you know what? For your understanding, I'm gonna share a video because I recorded the process of the perspective drawing for this project. I'm going to share the video together with the our option. It will be easier to understand. So this is the second option. So as you can see, I made the guideline with the ruler. So you can see this video in the sketchbook forum page. Now to find the perspective, the angle, I used the ruler and draw all the lines through the walls. This Just, follow the line from the, the wall, then you can find the angle of the picture. You don't need to print it out. This is just, guide video. So based on this, I started the sketch. I made the virtual lines to make the perspective angle. And then started draw the the vertical lines. That is the easiest way. So find the angle first and then draw the vertical line. That's the easiest way. So like this. So at the end, so when you find the all the big structure, then you can just draw all the single detailed things. And that's the final view. And here's another option. I chose the option 6. Like the first example, I used the ruler to find the perspective point. That is the 2-point perspective example. So like this at the end. No, it's just the same. Find the perspective line with the ruler and then draw the vertical line and just to draw the details. And when you're ready, please post to your work process. You don't need to finish it to by the due date, by Monday. You can just post the work process here with 10-2. So you will see this guide video in this page. Any question, everyone, about this sketchbook project?
If we don't draw the lines, will like points be deducted from our grade?
Can you say again?
If we don't draw the lines, will points be deducted from our grade?
You don't need to draw the line. This is just a guideline. So you don't need to draw it. You can just if you can just start to the angled line on your sketch. Any other question?
No.
And also, again, we have an assignment 2. The due date is by March 28th, Monday, not this Monday, following Monday. The assignment 2 is virtual museum tour. You're gonna go to a museum virtual. If you want, you can visit any local museum in person. It's up to you. So when you click this link, you will see many art museums in the world. Choose one of them and take a tour. And here is the assignment 2's guide. The first page is is the cover page. You're gonna write your name and the class name and the virtual visiting date and art museum name and the location. For the second page, you're gonna pick at least 5 masterpieces from the museum. and then copy and paste the artwork images, and then the artwork information called caption, including artist name, title, size, medium, which means material, such as oil on painting, acrylic on painting, acrylic on canvas, like that. And on the third page, you're gonna write your appreciation about the museum tour. That is the most important part of this assignment. For the third page, you're not gonna copy and paste any information from the resources. It must be written by your own words.